at 61 years old. Margaret Hale watched the front door of the house she had called home for more than 3 decades close behind her for the very last time. The divorce papers had been signed that morning. Her husband kept the house. He kept the savings. He kept almost everything they had built together. All Margaret drove away with was an aging station wagon, 2 suitcases, a few family photographs, and the quiet realization that starting over at 61 felt far more frightening than starting over at 21 ever could. Most people believed that chapter of her life was over. But just 2 weeks later, a lawyer handed her an envelope that changed everything. A distant uncle she barely remembered had left her a forgotten lighthouse sitting alone on a tiny island just off the coast. The transfer price, just $10. Friends told her to refuse it. Neighbors laughed when they heard she was spending her last few dollars on an abandoned lighthouse that hadn't guided a ship in more than 50 years. "You're buying a pile of rocks," one fisherman joked. "Even the seagulls gave up on that place years ago," another said. Still, Margaret climbed aboard a small ferry with the deed folded carefully inside her coat pocket. When she finally reached the island, she expected broken windows, rusted railings, and years of neglect. She found all of those, but she also found something nobody had mentioned. The heavy iron door leading into the lighthouse tower wasn't simply locked. It had been officially sealed. A rust-covered government plate was still bolted across the entrance. Stamped into the metal were words that hadn't been disturbed for more than half a century. Sealed by federal order. Do not enter. No one in the town could explain why. No one remembered what had happened inside. But when Margaret finally found a way to open that forgotten lighthouse, she uncovered a truth that had remained hidden from the world for more than 50 years. A truth that would forever change how an entire coastal town remembered one ordinary lighthouse keeper. Before we unlock that door together, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Whether you're enjoying this story with your morning coffee, relaxing after a long day, or listening late at night before bed, thank you for spending your time with me. I hope today brings you peace, good health, and at least one unexpected reason to smile. If you enjoy heartfelt stories about forgotten places, hidden family legacies, and second chances, please take a moment to subscribe so you won't miss future stories. And if you notice any mistakes or have suggestions that could make these stories even better, I'd truly appreciate your comments. Your feedback helps this channel grow and allows me to create even better stories for all of you. Now, let's go back to the day Margaret Hale believed she had lost everything. Never imagining that a lonely lighthouse waiting beyond the waves would become the beginning of the most meaningful chapter of her life. Margaret Hale had imagined growing old in the small white house overlooking Maple Street. For 34 years, she had planted flowers beneath its front windows every spring, painted the porch railing every other summer, and celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, and quiet Sunday dinners inside its familiar walls. She believed it would be the place where she and her husband would spend the rest of their lives. Instead, on a cool October morning, she stood outside the county courthouse with a folder containing finalized divorce papers and nowhere left that truly belonged to her. At 61 years old, she had never expected to begin again. The decision had not been hers. After months of growing distance, her husband had calmly explained that he wanted a different life with someone else. The house, most of their savings, and nearly every valuable possession had remained with him as part of the settlement. Margaret had signed each page without arguing. She was too tired to fight for walls that no longer felt like home. By late afternoon, her belongings fit into the back of her aging station wagon. 2 suitcases, several cardboard boxes filled with books, a small collection of family photographs, and an old quilt sewn by her mother were all that remained of decades spent building a life she believed would last forever. Before driving away, she looked at the front porch one final time, The flower beds she had cared for were still blooming. Someone else would water them now. She climbed into the driver's seat without looking back again. For the next several days, Margaret stayed in an inexpensive motel on the edge of town while searching for affordable apartments. Retirement income covered little beyond daily necessities, and every place she visited seemed just beyond her budget. At night, she lay awake listening to traffic outside her window, wondering how a lifetime of careful planning had disappeared so quickly. She had spent years helping children learn to read as an elementary school teacher. She had comforted frightened students, encouraged struggling families, and believed kindness always mattered. Yet kindness had not prepared her for loneliness. One rainy morning, her phone rang. The caller introduced himself as attorney Benjamin Cross. He explained that Margaret's great-uncle, Arthur Bennett, had passed away several weeks earlier. She barely remembered him. He had lived alone near the coast and had stopped visiting family gatherings long before she became an adult. Mr. Bennett left specific instructions regarding his estate, the lawyer explained. You are named as the sole beneficiary. Margaret assumed there had been a mistake. She expected perhaps an old watch or a few family photographs. Instead, the lawyer unfolded a faded map across his desk during their meeting. His finger rested on a tiny island several miles offshore. Your uncle owned this lighthouse, he said. Margaret stared at the map. A lighthouse? Benjamin nodded. Because of legal restrictions attached to the property, ownership transfers only through a symbolic purchase price, according to his will. If you wish to accept the inheritance, you must pay $10. Margaret almost smiled despite herself. $10? Exactly 10. He slid the documents toward her. Otherwise, ownership returns to the county, she signed, before giving herself time to overthink the decision. $10 could not possibly buy a future, but it was enough to buy one chance. News traveled quickly through the small coastal town. By the time Margaret stopped at a diner for lunch, 2 fishermen were already discussing the woman foolish enough to take ownership of the abandoned lighthouse. That old tower hasn't been useful in 50 years, one man laughed. Storms have done more work there than people ever will. Another shook his hand. She should have kept the $10. Margaret quietly finished her coffee without introducing herself. Their laughter followed her out the door. But somehow it hurt less than the silence she had left behind after the divorce. Early the following morning, she boarded a small ferry carrying little more than her overnight bag and the property deed tucked safely inside her coat pocket. Gray clouds drifted across the ocean, while cold wind pushed gentle waves against the hull. As the island slowly appeared through the mist, the lighthouse rose above the rocky shoreline like a lonely guardian, forgotten by time. Its white paint had peeled away in long strips. Rust stained the lantern room beneath the cracked glass. Wild grass surrounded the weathered keeper's cottage nearby. The place looked abandoned, yet strangely dignified, refusing to surrender completely to the sea. The ferry captain tied the boat to an aging wooden dock and wished her luck with a sympathetic smile. Margaret thanked him before carrying her bag toward the winding stone path. Every step echoed with seabirds circling overhead. When she reached the lighthouse entrance, she expected an ordinary padlock or boarded doorway. Instead, she stopped without breathing. Thick iron bars crossed the heavy steel door. A weathered federal seal remained bolted across the entrance despite decades of salt and storms. Beneath it hung a rust-covered metal plaque that read in faded black letters, "Sealed by federal order, do not enter." Margaret stood before the sealed lighthouse door for several minutes, her fingers resting lightly against the cold iron bars. Salt wind carried the cries of gulls across the island, while waves crashed against the rocks below. But nothing disturbed the silence surrounding the tower itself. It was as though the building had been holding its breath for decades. She traced the weathered federal seal with her eyes before finally stepping back. Whatever had happened inside, forcing the government to close the lighthouse more than 50 years earlier, would not be solved on her first morning. There was another problem demanding her attention. If she intended to stay even a few days, she needed somewhere dry to sleep. The keeper's cottage beside the tower looked neglected but still standing. Its roof sagged in one corner, and several shutters hung crooked. Yet the front door opened after a determined push. Dust covered nearly every surface. But unlike the lighthouse itself, the cottage had not been officially sealed. Margaret opened windows one by one, letting fresh sea air chase away years of stale silence. She found an old broom leaning inside a pantry and spent the afternoon sweeping sand, broken shells, and fallen plaster into neat piles. Every room required work. The kitchen sink no longer drained properly. The fireplace chimney was blocked by debris. Rain had stained the ceiling in 2 bedrooms. Still, compared with the motel room she had left behind, the little cottage already felt strangely peaceful. She paused only once, standing at the window overlooking the lighthouse. "I suppose we're both trying to start over," she whispered, unsure whether she meant herself or the forgotten tower. The next morning, the sound of a small boat approaching the dock interrupted her work. A tall man stepped ashore carrying a heavy toolbox over one shoulder. He introduced himself with an easy smile. "Ethan Brooks. Harbor maintenance asked me to check the old generator. They heard somebody actually moved into the island." Margaret smiled politely. "That's me." Ethan looked toward the lighthouse and laughed softly. "Most people avoid this place." "I've noticed." "Can't say I blame them," he admitted. "But I'd hate to see it fall apart completely." He explained that he repaired harbor lights, navigation equipment, and older coastal structures throughout the county. When he heard someone had inherited the abandoned lighthouse, curiosity brought him across the water. Together they examined the aging diesel generator behind the cottage. It coughed twice before falling silent. Ethan removed the side panel, studying the engine with experienced hands. "She's old," he said, patting the metal housing. "But so am I some mornings. We might both survive with enough patience." Margaret laughed more easily than she expected. By late afternoon, lights glowed inside the cottage for the first time in years. "That should hold you for a while," Ethan said, wiping grease from his hands. "Call me if anything else decides to quit." Before leaving, he glanced toward the sealed lighthouse door. "Never understood why they locked it. My grandfather always said nobody was allowed inside after 1972. Nobody ever explained more than that." His boat disappeared across the gray water, leaving Margaret alone once again with questions the island refused to answer. 2 days later, another visitor arrived on the afternoon ferry. An elderly woman carrying a wicker basket introduced herself as Eleanor Price. "I heard Arthur Bennett's niece finally came," she said warmly. "Thought you might appreciate some fresh bread." Margaret invited her inside. Over tea, Eleanor's eyes wandered often toward the lighthouse outside the kitchen window. "I grew up on the mainland," she said. "When I was little, my father delivered supplies here every month." Margaret leaned forward. "Did you know the lighthouse keeper?" Eleanor nodded slowly. "Samuel Whitaker. Kind man, quiet, always waved when our boat left." She hesitated before continuing. "Then one day, the lighthouse closed. Officials came. They sealed the tower. After that, nobody ever went inside again." Did anyone tell you why? Eleanor looked down into her teacup. No. Folks stopped asking after a while. Before returning to the ferry, Eleanor paused beside the lighthouse entrance. Her fingertips brushed the rusted warning plate almost gently. Some doors stay closed because people are afraid of what they'll remember, she said, before walking away. Her words lingered long after the boat disappeared beyond the rocks. The following morning, Margaret decided to examine the entrance more carefully. Kneeling near the heavy iron door, she noticed something she had missed before. Deep scratches surrounded the lock beneath the government seal. They were not old marks left by weather. Someone had once tried repeatedly to force the door open with metal tools before giving up. The discovery unsettled her. If everyone claimed the lighthouse had been forgotten, why had someone attempted to enter? She spent the rest of the afternoon searching the keeper's cottage. Inside drawers, cabinets, and dusty trunks, she found old dishes, faded blankets, rusted lantern parts, and finally a ring holding several antique brass keys tucked inside a kitchen cupboard. Hope stirred as she carried them outside. One after another, she tested every key against the weathered lock. Some would not fit. Others entered halfway before stopping completely. The final key turned slightly, but refused to move farther. Margaret sighed and slipped it back onto the ring. As she stepped away from the entrance, a strong gust of ocean wind rushed between the tower and the cottage. Something thin slid beneath the narrow gap at the bottom of the sealed lighthouse door and fluttered across the stone steps before coming to rest against her boots. She bent down and carefully picked it up. It was a small, weathered notebook, yellowed by age but remarkably intact, as though it had been waiting just inside the lighthouse all these years. Margaret carried the small notebook inside the cottage as if it might crumble from the warmth of her hands. Its cover was warped by age and stained along one corner. Yet the pages had survived behind the sealed door far better than anything left to the open sea air. She placed it on the kitchen table, wiped her palms against her sweater, and opened it carefully. The first pages did not contain personal thoughts or daily observations. They held measurements, sketches, and neat labels drawn in dark pencil. It was a plan of the lighthouse, not formal enough to be official, but precise enough to have been made by someone who knew every stair, wall, and chamber. Margaret recognized the entrance. The narrow storage room near the base, the keeper's workroom, the spiral stairs, and the lantern room at the top. Around the lantern room, several small symbols had been circled in red ink. Arrows pointed toward one wall and then down through the center of the tower, ending beside a note written in hurried script. Check inner lining before final inspection. She read the words twice, feeling the same unease she had felt when she saw the scratches around the lock. Inspection by whom? And why had the notebook been left just inside the sealed tower? When Ethan returned the next morning to bring fuel filters for the generator, she showed him the sketches before he even reached for his toolbox. He leaned over the kitchen table, his brows drawing together. "This isn't a tourist drawing," he said. "Whoever made this understood lighthouse construction." Margaret pointed to the red circles. "Do those marks mean anything?" Ethan studied them for a while. Maybe maintenance access, maybe ventilation. Old towers sometimes have voids between walls, depending on repairs made over the years. They walked together to the lighthouse entrance, then around the outside of the tower where the wind pushed at their coats. Ethan tapped sections of the stonework with the handle of a wrench, listening closely. Most places gave back a dull, solid sound. But near a narrow portion of wall beneath the lantern room's support line, The sound changed just slightly. Hollow, or at least less solid than the rest. He tapped again. Margaret heard it too. "There may be space behind that section," he said. "Not enough to climb through from here." But something was altered. The idea made the lighthouse feel less abandoned and more guarded. Before Margaret could answer, a voice called from the path near the dock. A young woman approached with a camera bag and a notebook tucked under one arm. "Mrs. Hale, I'm Claire Donovan with the Coastal Ledger." Margaret stiffened. She had no desire to become the local joke in print. Claire seemed to notice. "I know people have been talking," she said gently. "That's why I came to ask you directly. A 61-year-old woman inherits a sealed lighthouse for $10. That's the kind of story people twist if no one tells it right." Ethan gave Margaret a small nod, then returned to examining the stone. Margaret agreed to a brief interview, mostly to stop the guessing. They sat on a flat rock above the water while Claire asked about the inheritance, the island, and why Margaret had accepted it after everything she had lost in the divorce. For a moment, Margaret considered giving a practical answer. Instead, she looked toward the tower and said, "Maybe I know what it feels like to be abandoned before anyone checks whether there's still something worth saving." Claire stopped writing. Her expression softened, and when she took a photograph, she asked Margaret to stand not in front of the ruined cottage, but beside the sealed lighthouse door. Later that afternoon, Eleanor returned with a basket of apples and an old wool scarf she insisted Margaret take against the sea wind. Margaret showed her the notebook at the kitchen table. Eleanor's fingers trembled when she saw the sketch of the lantern room. "Do you remember who kept this light before it closed?" Margaret asked. Eleanor nodded slowly. "Samuel Whitaker. That was his name." She spoke it with the careful tone people use for names long avoided. "He was the last keeper." Ethan looked up. "What happened to him?" Eleanor stared through the window toward the tower. "Nobody was told. He was here 1 week, the next. Officials came across the water and sealed the door. My father asked questions at first, but he was warned not to interfere." "Do you know where Samuel was buried?" Margaret asked. Eleanor's eyes filled with old confusion. "No. There was no proper service here that I remember. Just rumors. And then silence." After Eleanor left, Margaret worked until dusk, more to steady herself than to clean. She dusted shelves, sorted broken lamp parts, and wiped salt film from the cottage windows. On a low shelf near the fireplace, she found an old oil lamp with a cracked glass chimney. When she lifted it to clean beneath, something rattled inside the hollow base. Margaret unscrewed the bottom with stiff fingers. A small brass key slid into her palm, tied to a faded tag marked in careful ink, "Lantern Room." Margaret did not try the brass key that evening. She sat at the cottage table with the little tag beside her untouched supper, listening to the wind press against the windows and the waves strike the rocks below. Lantern Room. The words should have felt like an answer, but instead, they deepened every question. If the lighthouse entrance had been sealed by federal order, why had someone hidden a key in the base of an old oil lamp inside the keeper's cottage? And why had that key been labeled so plainly, as though meant for the right person to find? She finally wrapped it in a handkerchief and placed it beneath her pillow, though sleep came in short, uneasy pieces. By dawn, she knew she could not open the tower alone. Ethan arrived before noon after Margaret sent word through the harbor office. He stepped from his boat carrying his toolbox, but when she showed him the key, he set the tools down carefully. "You understand," he said, looking toward the tower. "If that seal is still legally active, This could cause trouble. Margaret looked at the rusted plate on the door. I own the property now. And if they wanted the truth protected, they shouldn't have left it to rot. Ethan did not argue. Instead, he checked the hinges, the iron bars, and the lock beneath the old seal. We'll open only what the key opens, he said. No cutting, no forcing. Margaret appreciated the care in his voice. Together, they walked to the entrance. The sea wind tugged at her coat as she inserted the brass key into the weathered lock. At first, it refused to turn. Ethan placed one hand against the doorframe, steadying it while Margaret tried again. Slower this time. Something clicked deep inside the mechanism. The sound was small, but it seemed to travel through the stones beneath her feet. The iron bars loosened with a groan. The federal seal, attached to the outer brace, lifted with them as Ethan eased the barrier aside. The heavy steel door remained stuck until both of them pulled. It opened inward with a long, dry scrape, releasing air that smelled of metal, dust, salt, and old oil. Margaret stood on the threshold, suddenly aware that no one had crossed it since 1972. The base of the tower was dim but intact. Narrow windows had been covered from inside, leaving only thin seams of gray light along the stone. Shelves lined one wall, holding coils of rope, cracked glass lenses, and rusted tools arranged with surprising order. A log table stood near the stairs with a chair tucked beneath it. On a peg hung a dark wool keeper's coat, stiff with age but undisturbed. Nothing looked abandoned in panic. It looked paused. Ethan switched on a flashlight and swept the beam upward along the spiral stairs. Dust coated every step. Their footprints became the first marks in decades. Margaret climbed slowly, one hand on the cold rail. Halfway up, they found a small wall clock mounted beside a landing. Its hands had stopped at 2:13. Power failure, Ethan murmured. Margaret did not answer. The time felt too deliberate. At the top, the lantern room waited behind an interior door, and the brass key turned there as well. When Margaret opened it, pale daylight spilled across the old Fresnel lens, cloudy but still magnificent beneath the dust. The great lamp stood silent in the center, surrounded by cabinets, oil tins, tools, and a narrow desk built into the wall. Everything had been kept with the same careful order as the rooms below. A row of filing boxes rested beneath the desk, each labeled by year. Beside them sat a small iron safe with a combination dial, its black surface dulled but intact. Ethan knelt before it and shook his head. No keyhole. We'll need the combination. Margaret's attention had shifted to a stack of envelopes tied with faded cord. Each envelope bore the name of a vessel in careful handwriting. The Maribel Ann, the North Star, the Lydia Grace. The names continued across dozens, then hundreds of envelopes arranged in wooden trays. Some were marked with dates. Others carried small notations: fog, gale, engine failure, distress flare sighted. Margaret picked up one envelope, but did not open it. The number alone made her feel the weight of lives moving unseen beyond the glass. On the desk lay a leather-bound journal open near the end. Unlike the notebook from the door, this was personal, written in a steady hand that grew more compressed on the final pages. Margaret bent over it while Ethan stood beside the great lens. The last entry was short. The date matched the year Eleanor had mentioned. Several lines described heavy fog, failing equipment, and orders received from the mainland. The final sentence, written darker than the rest, seemed to wait for her. Margaret read it silently first, then aloud into the sealed lantern room. If this light shines again, let the truth shine with it. Margaret remained in the lantern room long after she read the final sentence aloud. If this light shines again, let the truth shine with it. The words seemed to settle into the glass, the metal, the old lens, and the narrow circle of sea visible beyond the salt-streaked windows. Ethan stood quietly near the railing, giving her time. She had opened the sealed tower, expecting, perhaps, an explanation for why it had been closed. Instead, she had found a room that felt less abandoned than interrupted, as if Samuel Whitaker had stepped away for one moment and never been allowed to return. At last, Margaret lowered herself into the chair beside the narrow desk and turned the journal back several pages. Samuel's handwriting was careful, plain, and exact. He recorded weather first, as lighthouse keepers did, wind direction, visibility, tide, lantern condition. Then, mixed between those ordinary details, the entries began to reveal something else. Mainland office orders reduced lighting after midnight except during declared storms. One entry read, fog thick by 10, kept lamp burning at personal expense. Margaret read it twice before looking up. Personal expense, she whispered. Ethan came closer. Fuel wasn't cheap, especially for a station this far out. She turned another page. Another entry mentioned a fishing boat delayed in heavy fog. Another named a cargo vessel whose compass had failed near the reef. Again and again, Samuel wrote that he had kept the lantern burning beyond authorized hours because the sea did not obey office schedules. Sometimes he noted that no vessel was seen, only that conditions were dangerous. Other nights, a ship's whistle answered from the dark. The journal held no pride. It held work. Oil ordered privately, lens polished after midnight, wick replaced with personal funds, lantern maintained despite instruction to conserve. Margaret felt a slow ache build inside her. She had spent years accepting small erasures in her marriage, small dismissals, small silences, until one day her life had been divided on paper and handed away. Samuel's erasure was different, but she recognized the shape of it. A person could give everything and still be written out by those who valued rules more than care. Ethan began opening the vessel envelopes one at a time, with Margaret's permission. Inside each were copies of reports, handwritten notes, sometimes letters from captains or families. The Maribel Ann had avoided the rocks during a winter gale after seeing the light when it should not have been burning. The North Star had followed the beam through fog after engine trouble left her drifting. The Lydia Grace carried 3 injured sailors who reached harbor because the lighthouse remained visible beyond the ordered cutoff hour. Ethan compared names against an old maritime registry he had brought on his phone, his face growing more serious with every match. These ships existed, he said. These incidents line up with coastal records, at least some of them. But the official reports don't mention Samuel keeping the light on against orders. Would they have wanted that written down? Margaret asked. Ethan's silence answered. By afternoon, Claire arrived after Margaret sent word through the harbor office. The young reporter climbed the tower stairs breathlessly, then stopped at the lantern room door when she saw the envelopes spread across the desk. Please tell me this isn't just old maintenance paperwork, she said softly. Margaret handed her the journal. Claire read several entries, then sat down without taking a single photograph. He was saving ships they had already decided weren't worth the cost of protecting after hours. Not officially, Ethan said. Officially. He was probably violating orders. They continued sorting until the light outside turned silver. Samuel's notes revealed a pattern. He had paid for fuel himself when budgets tightened. He repaired the mechanism with parts bought from his own wages. He kept watch during fog storms and moonless nights, even when regulations said the lamp could remain dark unless a warning had been formally issued. He had also written letters to families after accidents nearby, sometimes sending small amounts of money to widows or injured sailors until other help arrived. Margaret found those notes hardest to read. Samuel had not only guided ships, he had carried the grief of the ones he could not save. Near the bottom of one filing box, Ethan found a folded schedule showing official operating hours for the lighthouse in its final years. Red marks in Samuel's hand covered the margins beside dates of storms and fog. He knew the rules were wrong, Ethan said, so he broke them quietly. A boat engine sounded near the dock before anyone could answer. Margaret looked down from the lantern windows and saw Mayor Richard Collins stepping onto the island path in a dark raincoat, followed by a harbor officer. His expression was not angry, but it was firm in the way of someone arriving with authority. "Mrs. Hale," he called when he reached the base of the tower. "We need to discuss unauthorized access to a federally sealed structure." Margaret descended with the journal held against her chest. Ethan and Claire followed. The mayor looked past them into the open doorway, taking in the broken seal and the dark stairwell beyond. "This building was closed for a reason," he said, "and until the county completes a safety review, no one should be inside." "There are records in there," Margaret replied. "Important ones." Mayor Collins sighed. "Old paper does not change liability. The island has already drawn interest from developers willing to restore the shoreline properly. You should consider transferring the property before this becomes an expensive mistake." Claire lifted her chin. "Have you seen what she found?" "I have seen an unsafe tower and an owner who may not understand the cost of keeping it." The words stung because Margaret knew part of him was right. She had $10 of ownership and almost no money for repairs. But she also knew the tower now held more than weather damage. After the mayor left, she returned to the lantern room and opened the final filing box. Beneath several vessel envelopes lay a thick register bound with blue cloth. Inside were columns of names, not of ships this time, but sailors, passengers, fishermen, widows, children, and families connected to the rescues and losses Samuel had recorded. Page after page continued in his steady hand. By the time Margaret reached the last filled section, she understood the lighthouse had touched far more lives than anyone had remembered. The list held more than 1,000 names. Claire's first article appeared the following morning, just as fog rolled low across the harbor and blurred the island from the mainland. Margaret saw the headline on Ethan's phone while standing inside the keeper's cottage with a cup of coffee gone cold in her hands. The sealed lighthouse and the keeper who would not let the light die. Beneath it was Claire's photograph of the rusted federal plate, the open tower door, and Samuel Whitaker's journal resting beneath the dusty lantern glass. Margaret read the article slowly. Claire had been careful. She did not turn Samuel into a legend overnight or accuse anyone of cruelty without proof. She simply laid out what had been found: the reduced lighting orders, the vessel envelopes, the private fuel purchases, the register of names, and the question no one in town had asked for more than 50 years. How many people had made it home because one lighthouse keeper kept the lamp burning when he was told not to? By noon, the first boat arrived. An older man named Paul Reardon stepped onto the dock with his granddaughter holding his arm and a framed photograph tucked beneath his coat. His father had served on a fishing vessel called the North Star. Margaret found the envelope Ethan had opened the day before and showed him Samuel's note about fog. Engine trouble, and a signal answered at 1:40 in the morning. Paul stared at the handwriting for a long time. My father used to say a light came out of nowhere, he said. He said every man on that boat owed his life to it. His granddaughter wiped tears from her face before Margaret realized she was crying too. That afternoon brought more visitors. A woman from the next county carried a shoebox of letters written by her grandfather, a sailor injured aboard the Lydia Grace. One letter mentioned a lighthouse keeper who sent money for medicine until the shipping company settled the claim. Another family brought a Bible with a newspaper clipping tucked inside, describing a storm near the reef and a ship that reached harbor safely after sighting the island light. Not every story matched perfectly, and Margaret refused to force certainty where records were unclear. But enough names aligned that the tower seemed to fill with voices from the sea captains, fishermen, cooks, deckhands, passengers, wives, widows, children who had grown old because someone else survived. Eleanor came in the late afternoon and sat near the cottage window, listening as people spoke. When she heard Samuel had sent money to families after accidents, her face tightened with a memory. "There was a woman who came once," she said. "I was little. She had 2 children with her. Samuel met her at the dock and gave her an envelope. My father told me not to stare." Margaret opened the register and found an entry that might have been the one. Widow of Henry Lask. Assistance sent after wreck inquiry delayed. Eleanor touched the page. "He wasn't only keeping ships away from rocks," she whispered. "He was trying to keep families from sinking after the storm was over." The words stayed with Margaret. Until then, she had pictured Samuel alone in the lantern room, fighting darkness with flame. Now she saw a wider truth. His work had continued after ships reached shore. He had written letters for injured men who could not work. He had sent small payments to widows waiting on official claims. He had connected orphan children to relatives in other ports. His light had not stopped at the waterline. The community began to change in small, visible ways. Fishermen who had laughed at Margaret in the diner sent over coils of rope, plywood, and fresh batteries. The ferry captain offered free trips for volunteers carrying supplies. Ethan organized a safety rope along the dock and patched the weakest boards near the path. Claire kept updating the story, but she also helped Margaret sort names without rushing the families who arrived. Still, the obstacles remained. Mayor Collins sent a written notice limiting access to the tower until a formal inspection could be completed. A storm warning forced Ethan to secure the open entrance with temporary braces. Margaret spent 1 long hour alone in the lantern room, looking at the unlit lens and wondering whether $10 had bought her a duty too large for one woman. Then she heard laughter below. Eleanor was teaching Claire how to make strong dockside coffee, while Ethan argued with the generator and lost. The sound made the cottage feel less empty. As evening settled, Margaret returned to the lantern room with Claire and Ethan to store the records away from damp air. They worked by flashlight, tying vessel envelopes, covering the register, and moving fragile papers into sealed containers Ethan had brought from the harbor office. Near the back of the lowest filing cabinet, behind a stack of blank weather forms, Margaret felt a ridge of paper thicker than the rest. She drew it out carefully. It was a sealed envelope, yellowed but intact, addressed in Samuel Whitaker's steady hand. Across the front were the words, "Open only when the lighthouse shines again." Margaret held the envelope beneath the lantern room windows, where the late light had turned the sea to dull silver. Open only when the lighthouse shines again. The words seemed to ask for something the tower had not yet given. The great lens above them remained dark, its glass cloudy with age, its mechanism silent after half a century. Ethan looked from the envelope to the lamp. "We can make the small service light work," he said carefully. "Not the full beacon. Not safely yet." Claire lowered the storage container she had been carrying. Would that count? Margaret looked at the dust-covered lens, the sealed records, and the doorway where people had begun climbing the stairs with stories in their hands. Samuel kept this light burning because people needed hope in bad weather, she said. Maybe tonight, hope is enough. Ethan worked for nearly an hour with tools, wire, and the temporary generator line from the cottage. Margaret and Claire cleaned the glass around the old lamp housing, while Eleanor, who had insisted on staying despite the wind, sat on the upper step wrapped in a blanket. When Ethan finally stepped back and nodded, Margaret placed her hand on the switch. The light that came on was modest, not strong enough to guide ships through fog or sweep across miles of black water, but it glowed through the old lens and scattered a pale circle across the lantern room. Eleanor began to cry quietly. Claire did not take a photograph, for once. No one seemed to want proof more than they wanted the moment itself. Margaret opened Samuel's envelope with careful fingers. Inside was a letter written in the same steady hand as the journal, though the final lines looked less firm. She read it aloud. Samuel wrote that if the letter had been found, then either the tower had survived or someone had cared enough to enter a place others ordered closed. He wrote that he knew the mainland office considered him difficult, wasteful, and disobedient. He admitted he had kept the lamp burning beyond approved hours, purchased fuel from his own wages, repaired mechanisms without reimbursement, and answered distress signals even when no official storm warning had been issued. The sea does not wait for permission to become dangerous. Margaret read, her voice shaking, and a light that is dark when needed most is no light at all. Ethan looked down. Eleanor pressed the blanket to her mouth. Samuel continued that he did not regret breaking the rules, only the lives he could not save. He asked that if the truth ever surfaced, the records be used not to clear his name for pride, but to protect the memory of every sailor, passenger, widow, child, and family whose story had passed through the light. He believed the lighthouse belonged not to the government or the county, but to every person who had looked for it in darkness. The final paragraph was addressed to whoever lit the lamp again. Do not let them make this place a monument to me. Margaret read. Let it be a promise that when someone is lost, someone else will keep watch. When she finished, only the wind spoke. Claire wiped her eyes with her sleeve. People need to hear this, she said. Margaret folded the letter, but her hands lingered over it. She had been told at 61 that her usefulness had ended, that her marriage, home, and years of giving could be reduced to signatures and settlements. Yet here was a man who had given quietly until almost nothing remained. Asking not to be praised, but continued, it made her feel both small and necessary. Ethan cleared his throat and turned toward the spiral stairs. There was one more thing on that sketch, he said. The hollow space near the inner wall. If Samuel hid this letter, he may have hidden something else. They descended carefully, the service light still glowing above. Near the lower curve of the staircase, Ethan tapped along the stone and wooden trim, where the notebook's red arrows had pointed. One section beneath the stairs sounded different. He removed 2 corroded screws from a narrow access panel nearly invisible beneath dust and old paint. The panel resisted, then loosened with a low scrape. Behind it was a dry compartment built into the base of the stairwell. Margaret knelt beside him as he reached inside and drew out a metal cash box wrapped in oilcloth. It was not locked. Inside lay a thick account book, several receipts, and small envelopes bundled by year. Unlike the vessel register, these pages held numbers, fuel purchases, lamp oil, replacement wicks, lens polishing compounds, spare gears, postage, medicine sent to families, ferry payments, and wages spent down to the dollar. Ethan read silently for a long time, his jaw tightening. He paid for nearly all of it himself. Margaret turned page after page. The totals grew steadily larger through the years. Some months, Samuel had kept only a few dollars for personal needs. Several entries noted items sold: watch, silver compass, spare furniture, mother's china. Every sacrifice had been recorded without complaint. Near the final page, one total was underlined twice. Margaret stared at the sum, then at the soft light still shining above them. Samuel Whitaker had spent nearly everything he had to keep the lighthouse alive. Samuel Whitaker's account book lay open on the cottage table the next morning while rain tapped softly against the windows and the service light glowed faintly in the tower above. Margaret had carried the book down before dawn, unable to leave it in the cold stairwell after understanding what it contained. Ethan sat across from her with copies of coastal maintenance records spread beside his coffee. Claire worked near the stove, comparing names from the vessel envelopes with letters sent by families after her articles appeared. Eleanor rested in the corner chair, wrapped in her wool coat, listening more than speaking. But every so often she supplied a place name or remembered a family connected to the harbor. The truth was no longer one discovery. It was a pattern too large to dismiss. Samuel had paid for fuel when the mainland reduced hours. He had bought parts when orders were delayed or denied. He had sent money after wrecks, written letters to employers, and helped widows file claims when official paperwork moved too slowly. Margaret matched one receipt for lantern oil to a foggy night in the journal, then to a vessel envelope marked the Maribel Ann, then to a letter from a captain's grandson describing how the ship had avoided the reef by following a light that should not have been burning. Each connection felt like another stone placed beneath her feet. She was no longer standing on rumor. She was standing on proof. By midday, families began arriving again despite the weather. A father and teenage son brought a rusted brass bell recovered from a fishing boat saved near the island in 1968. An elderly woman unfolded a letter her mother had kept in a Bible, thanking an unnamed keeper for helping with funeral costs after a sailor died far from home. A former harbor clerk's daughter recognized her father's initials beside several entries in Samuel's register and began to cry when she realized he had helped send telegrams without charging desperate families. Margaret watched these strangers lean over the table together, connecting lives separated by decades, and she felt the loneliness of her motel room recede like tide water. She had arrived on the island as a woman people pitied or laughed at. Now they looked to her to hold the fragile pieces of their own history. The responsibility frightened her, but it also gave her spine a strength she thought the divorce had taken. Practical trouble returned with Mayor Collins just after noon. He arrived with 2 council members and a county safety officer, their raincoats shining with water. Margaret met them outside the cottage before they could climb the tower path. The mayor's face held less certainty than before, but he still carried a folder thick with documents. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "the island has become an active public site without approval. That creates serious liability. I cannot ignore it." "I know," Margaret replied, "and I won't pretend the tower is safe for crowds." Ethan stepped beside her. "We've limited access and braced the entrance. I can provide a temporary safety plan." Claire appeared in the doorway with her recorder lowered, not threatening, simply present. The mayor glanced toward the families waiting inside the cottage, then toward the tower where the small light still glowed dimly through gray rain. "People are calling my office," he said. "Some want the resort project stopped. Some want the lighthouse preserved. Some want to know why they never heard Samuel Whitaker's name." His voice softened on the last sentence. Margaret opened the account book to the marked pages and placed it on the porch table beneath the awning. "Then look at what he did before deciding what this place is worth." The mayor did not answer quickly. He read the expenses, the names, the notes about fuel purchased and medicine sent. One council member asked to see the vessel envelopes. The safety officer, less moved but not unkind, walked the path with Ethan and identified urgent repairs needed before any public opening. For once, the conversation was not about tearing down or selling off. It was about what saving would require. That afternoon, word spread across town faster than any official notice. Boats brought plywood, waterproof storage bins, rope, sandbags, and food. Fishermen who had mocked Margaret at the diner worked beside retired teachers and shop owners, hauling debris from the path and securing tarps over the keeper's cottage roof. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table helping Claire label family statements. Ethan organized volunteers with calm authority, turning away anyone who tried to enter unsafe areas. Mayor Collins stayed longer than Margaret expected. She saw him standing alone near the lighthouse door, reading the federal warning plate as rain ran down the rusted metal. When he returned to the cottage, he spoke quietly. "My mother used to say her uncle survived a wreck because of this light. I thought it was family exaggeration." Margaret waited. "His name may be in that register." The mayor looked at the book, and for the first time, his interest seemed personal, not political. "Perhaps I should have asked sooner." It was not an apology, but it was close enough for that moment. As evening fell, the rain cleared and the sea turned dark blue beneath broken clouds. Margaret, Ethan, and Claire carried the most fragile records back to the lantern room, placing them in sealed containers away from damp air. The small service light glowed over their shoulders as they worked. While checking the narrow desk one final time, Margaret noticed a shallow drawer stuck beneath the writing surface. Ethan loosened it carefully with a flat tool. Inside, wrapped in brown paper and tied with black string, lay a formal envelope addressed to Samuel Whitaker, in handwriting that was not his. In the upper corner, stamped in faded red ink, were the words, "Undelivered, return to Maritime Board." Margaret untied the string, unfolded the first page, and realized it was a letter Samuel had never received. Margaret stared at the undelivered letter while the small service light glowed above the lantern room, throwing a pale circle across Samuel Whitaker's desk. The paper bore the official seal of the Maritime Board, faded but still clear, and the date placed it only days before the lighthouse had been sealed in 1972. Ethan stood beside the open drawer, rainwater still darkening the shoulders of his coat. Claire leaned closer, her recorder forgotten in her hand. None of them spoke until Margaret unfolded the page completely and began to read. The letter was formal, almost cold in its wording, but its meaning was unmistakable. After review of multiple testimonials, rescue records, and statements from vessels aided near the reef, Samuel Whitaker had been selected to receive a National Maritime Service Medal for extraordinary dedication to coastal safety. The board acknowledged that his actions had preserved lives during fog storms and equipment failures, and that several captains had credited the island light with preventing disaster. Margaret stopped when her voice faltered. Eleanor, who had climbed only as far as the lantern room doorway with Ethan's help, closed her eyes. "He never knew," she whispered. Claire took the second page gently and read the final paragraph. A ceremony had been scheduled on the mainland. The medal would recognize Samuel's lifelong vigilance and exceptional service to mariners and their families. But handwritten across the bottom, in a different ink, were 3 words: "Station closed indefinitely." No forwarding address had been added. No later note explained whether anyone had tried again. Ethan looked toward the lens. "They were going to honor him," he said quietly. "Then they sealed the place and let his name disappear." Margaret folded the letter with care, but her hands trembled. She thought of the journal, the account book, the names of sailors and families, the personal items sold for fuel, and now this final proof that someone, somewhere, had once understood. The honor had simply arrived too late, then been buried with everything else. "Not anymore," she said. Claire's next article changed the mood of the town completely. It was not loud or accusing. It showed the letter, the service medal decision, Samuel's records, and the testimonies of families who had begun coming forward. By the next morning, flowers appeared at the harbor dock. Someone placed a lantern beside the ferry office. Fishermen tied strips of white cloth to their boats in quiet tribute. Mayor Collins called an emergency council session and asked Margaret to bring the documents. The meeting was held in the town hall because too many people wanted to attend. Margaret wore the same dark dress she had worn to court on the day her divorce was finalized. But this time she did not feel emptied by it. She carried Samuel's journal, the account book, the register of names, and the undelivered medal letter in a waterproof case Ethan had found for her. Claire stood near the back with her camera. Eleanor sat in the front row, wrapped in her scarf. When Margaret was called to speak, she placed the documents on the council table one by one. She did not try to make Samuel larger than life. She told them exactly what had been found: the orders reducing the light, the fuel he bought himself, the ships that survived, the widows he helped, the names he recorded, and the honor that never reached him. This lighthouse was sealed because people chose rules, silence, and convenience, she said. But the records inside show something stronger. They show a man who kept watch when others looked away. After her, the family spoke. Paul Reardon told the council his father had survived because the North Star saw the forbidden light through fog. A woman read from her grandfather's letter about the Lydia Grace. Eleanor stood with difficulty and remembered Samuel waving from the dock when she was a child. Her voice shook, but her words were clear. "He was not a scandal," she said. "He was a keeper. And we failed to keep him." Even Mayor Collins looked down at that. When the public comments ended, the council recessed. Margaret waited in the hallway with Ethan, Claire, and Eleanor. She had faced many closed doors in her life, but this one felt different. This door would decide whether Samuel's light became history or rubble beneath a resort. When the council returned, Mayor Collins announced that all development negotiations would be suspended. The town would petition for emergency historic designation of the lighthouse and request formal posthumous recognition of Samuel Whitaker's service from the Maritime Board. A memorial would be held on the island before any further decision about restoration. Applause filled the room, but Margaret felt only quiet relief. 2 days later, under a clear blue sky, boats crossed to the island carrying families, townspeople, flowers, old photographs, and hand lanterns. Volunteers had cleared the path and secured the dock. Samuel's name was placed on a simple wooden stand beneath the tower. Beside the letter announcing the medal he never received, Claire read a short account of his service. Ethan rang the old brass bell 3 times. Eleanor placed a single white shell at the base of the stand and whispered goodbye. Margaret watched the crowd bow their heads, and for the first time, the sealed lighthouse no longer felt like a warning. It felt like a wound finally uncovered so it could begin to heal. Near sunset, Mayor Collins approached her at the foot of the tower with a sealed envelope bearing the town seal. "The council completed its first vote this afternoon," he said. "This is the decision on whether the lighthouse remains under your stewardship while the historic petition moves forward." Margaret took the envelope, feeling the wind rise from the sea, and opened the flap. Margaret opened the town envelope with the sea wind tugging at the edges of the paper. For one terrible second, the official language blurred before her eyes, and she feared she had misunderstood everything. Then the words settled into meaning. The council had voted to suspend all sale and development negotiations connected to the island. The lighthouse would remain under her stewardship while the historic designation moved forward, and emergency funds would be released for basic stabilization, provided public access stayed limited until safety work was complete. Margaret pressed the letter against her coat and closed her eyes. Around her, the crowd on the island waited, and when Mayor Collins gave a small nod, applause rose along the rocks, the dock, and the base of the tower. Eleanor cried into her handkerchief. Ethan smiled with the quiet relief of a man already making a repair list in his head. Claire took one photograph, then lowered the camera, letting the moment belong to the people who had crossed the water to remember Samuel Whitaker. The lighthouse was not saved in a single day, but it was no longer abandoned to silence. Work began the following week. Ethan became the person everyone turned to when boards needed bracing, rusted bolts needed loosening, or the generator coughed itself into stubborn refusal. He never called himself manager until the town committee finally put the title on a form, and Margaret told him refusing it would only create more paperwork. Volunteers repaired the dock first, then the cottage roof, then the cracked path climbing toward the tower. The lantern room was cleaned slowly, glass panel by glass panel. The old Fresnel lens, once cloudy with salt and dust, began to gather sunlight again. The keeper's room at the tower base became a small museum, plain and honest. Samuel's coat hung protected behind glass. His journal, the account book, and the register of names were copied, indexed, and displayed in rotation so families could find the stories tied to their own. The undelivered medal letter was framed beside a new certificate from the Maritime Board acknowledging Samuel Whitaker's service at last. When the posthumous medal arrived, Margaret expected triumph. Instead, she felt a tender sadness. Recognition was good, but it could not give Samuel back the years when his name had been left out of every official telling. Eleanor stood beside her when the medal was placed beneath the lantern room light and whispered, "Late is not the same as never." Claire's book came out the next spring. Its cover showed the sealed lighthouse door before Margaret opened it, the rusted warning plate still visible beneath streaks of salt. She titled it, "The Keeper Who Would Not Let the Light Die." People from other coastal towns came to the island after reading it, some curious, some grieving, some carrying old family stories they hoped might connect to Samuel's records. Margaret learned to guide them gently. She did not make Samuel sound perfect or grand. He was a man who believed darkness was not an excuse to stop watching, she told visitors. That was enough to change many lives. Over time, Margaret changed too. She moved out of the motel and into the repaired keeper's cottage, where the kitchen windows faced the sea and the tower rose beside her like a patient friend. She still had little money, but she had work that mattered. She answered letters from descendants. She helped school children trace ships on old maps. She brewed tea for Eleanor when the crossing tired her. She argued with Ethan about whether a railing was historically accurate or merely ugly. Some evenings, after visitors left, she climbed the spiral stairs alone and stood beneath the restored lens, watching dusk gather over the water. She no longer thought of herself as the woman who had been left behind in a divorce settlement. She was the keeper of a story that had waited 50 years for a witness. On the first anniversary of the lighthouse reopening, fog rolled in thick before sunset. The public celebration had ended early, and most boats had returned to the mainland before visibility dropped. Margaret was closing the keeper's room when she heard hesitant footsteps outside. A young woman stood near the doorway, damp from the mist, one hand gripping the strap of a worn backpack. She looked no more than 22, with red eyes and the guarded expression of someone prepared to apologize for existing. "I'm sorry," the young woman said. "The ferry office was closed, and I just needed somewhere to stand out of the fog. I'll leave." Margaret saw the thin jacket, the trembling hands, the fear of being turned away. For a moment, she saw herself outside the courthouse, 61 years old with 2 suitcases and no place that belonged to her. Then she thought of Samuel lighting the lamp when rules said darkness was acceptable. "You don't have to leave," Margaret said. The young woman swallowed. "I can't pay for anything. This place was never really about payment." Margaret unlocked the inner door and led her into the base of the tower. Above them, the restored mechanism waited, ready for demonstration during tours. But tonight the fog pressed close, and the sea had vanished into gray. Margaret climbed the stairs slowly, the young woman following. In the lantern room, she turned on the light. It was not the old, desperate flame Samuel had fed with his wages, but it passed through the same glass and reached into the same fog. The young woman stared as the beam softened the darkness beyond the windows. Margaret smiled gently and said, "This light once guided lost ships home. Maybe tonight it can help a person find the next step, too." The young woman began to cry then, quietly, without shame. Margaret did not ask for her whole story at once. She simply pulled a chair beside Samuel's desk, set out paper, tea from a thermos, and the guest book filled with names of those who had come seeking connection. Outside, the fog wrapped the island. Inside, the lighthouse shone again, not as a monument to loss, but as a promise carried forward when someone is lost. Someone else will keep watch. The greatest secret hidden inside the sealed lighthouse was never a chest of gold, forgotten jewels, or government secrets. It was the life of Samuel Whitaker. For years, the last lighthouse keeper had quietly defied official orders to keep the beacon shining long after budget cuts demanded the light be extinguished. When government officials reduced operating hours to save money, Samuel refused to let darkness decide who lived and who died. Night after night, he bought lamp oil with his own wages. He repaired broken machinery with money meant for his own home. He sold personal belongings when the lighthouse could no longer afford replacement parts. Every gallon of fuel, every repaired gear, every polished lens came from his own pocket. But Samuel's kindness did not end at the shoreline. Inside the sealed records were hundreds of handwritten notes documenting sailors rescued from storms, fishing crews guided safely through heavy fog, widows who received quiet financial help, injured seamen whose medical bills he secretly paid, and children whose futures survived because their fathers made it home. He recorded every name, not because he wanted recognition, but because he believed no life saved should ever be forgotten. Then came the investigation. Officials concluded that Samuel had repeatedly violated government operating regulations. The lighthouse was closed. The tower was sealed. His records were locked away, and the ceremony meant to honor him with one of the nation's highest maritime service medals never happened. The award letter never reached his hands. His name slowly disappeared from public memory, yet the light he refused to extinguish continued shining in another way. The sailors he guided home became fathers. Those fathers became grandfathers. Families grew. Generations were born. Entire bloodlines existed because one ordinary lighthouse keeper chose compassion over convenience. When Margaret Hale inherited the forgotten lighthouse for only $10, she believed she was receiving nothing more than an abandoned building that everyone else had given up on. Instead, she inherited a responsibility. She became the person who finally unlocked a truth the sea had guarded for more than 50 years. She did not rescue the lighthouse. The lighthouse rescued her. Because while restoring Samuel Whitaker's forgotten legacy, Margaret also rebuilt her own. After losing her marriage, her home, and the life she thought defined her, she discovered something far more valuable than any inheritance. She discovered that purpose can begin at any age, that being left behind is not the same as being finished, and that the brightest lights are often kept alive by people whose names history almost forgets. The lighthouse was never worth $10. Its true value could never be measured in money. Its greatest treasure was the quiet proof that one compassionate person standing faithfully in the darkness can illuminate the lives of countless strangers long after their own light is gone. Some inherit wealth, some inherit property. Margaret Hale inherited a light, and by choosing to keep it shining, she ensured that Samuel Whitaker's beacon would never again fade into the darkness.